Hi, boys and girls. So today I'm starting the worldwide adventure. This is the sixth book. It's called African Safari Discovery. And I'm going to continue reading Flat Stanley because apparently today you guys made me so happy when most of you raised your hand that you are reading along with me as long as you have time to. And this book is just so good. And we're really enjoying the series of it. And David, I didn't find the one you wanted me to read, the one that Emma told us that she has. I have 20 of them, but I just don't have that particular one. So I decided you might enjoy this one. I do have the very first Stanley, but I think we've been reading like his discoveries that it'd be kind of weird to go back to reading how he became flat. Maybe I'll read it another week. So this one is called The Search Begins. Stanley Lambchop was flattened against the wall outside the kitchen. He knew it was impolite to eavesdrop, but his mother sounded upset, and she was talking about him. I'm worried about Stanley, Harriet Lambchop was saying to her husband, George. What if he's flat for the rest of... What if he's flat for the rest of his life? Do you know how difficult things can be for someone who's special? Stanley thought of the morning... Sorry. Oy vey. Sorry. Stanley thought of the morning not long ago when he awoke to find that the bulletin board over his head had fallen on him during the night. Ever since he'd been only half an inch thick. With his new shape, Stanley could do all sorts of things most people couldn't do, such as travel via airmail. But his mother was right. Just yesterday, someone at school had called him board brains. I'm sure everything will be fine, dear, Mr. Lambchop said. Just because Stanley has gone flat. Become flat, Miss Lambchop said. Stanley hasn't gone flat, George. He's become flat. You know how improper grammar makes me. She was overcome with emotions. Stanley peeled himself off the wall and trudged down the hall. He felt like being alone. A moment later, he was flat on his bed beneath the couch in the living room. It may have been too low to the ground for the vacuum cleaner, but it wasn't too low for Stanley, or for how he felt. Stanley should have been excited to find all the things that he and his little brother Arthur had lost under the couch. There was a dusty origami ninja star with which Stanley had made after traveling by mail to meet the boy's idol, the martial arts star Otonobu, in Japan. There was a hockey puck from the professional game in Canada where Stanley had recently slid across the ice. There was a yellow race car that Arthur liked to run down Stanley's body like a giant ram. Stanley didn't want to be flat forever. He imagined how lonely he would be if he were the only flat person he knew for as long as he lived. The doorbell rang. Stanley heard his father answer. Mr. Dart, Mr. Lambchop said. Mr. O.J. Dart was the director of the famous museum and the Lambchop's neighbor. Stanley had helped him foil some sneak thieves when he first became flattened. He'd had to dress up like a shepherdess in a white dress and a curly wig and pretend to be in painting. It was humiliating. Good morning, George. Have you seen this morning's paper? Mr. Dart said as Mr. Lambchop led him into the kitchen. A minute later, Stanley's father called Stanley. Oh, great, thought Stanley. I must be in trouble. Stanley? His father shouted again. Stanley saw Arthur's sneakers race into the living room. Stanley, Stanley. Uh-oh, we're about to hear some news. Stanley. Mr. Lambchop, gray, high-heeled shoes marched past Stanley. Stanley, Stanley, Stanley. Shoes paraded before Stanley's eyes. Door opened and closed in other rooms. His family and Mr. Dart were looking everywhere for him. Where could that boy be? Mr. Lambchop returned to the living room, her toe tapping the carpet obnoxiously. You're sure he didn't go out? Mr. Dart's brown loafers asked. Maybe he saw it already, wondered Arthur's sneakers. Stanley slid his head out from under the couch and looked up at everyone towering over him. Saw what? Mr. Dart thrust a newspaper in Stanley's face. Stanley, my boy, they found a flat skull in Africa. Stanley read. Flat skull discovered in Africa. Scientists claim to make a startling discovery yesterday when they unearthed a flat skull in remote Tanzania. The skull is highly unusual due to its shape. Scientists believe that this may be the missing link between flat creatures and regular ones. The discovery was nearly lost forever after a group of local children tried to play a game similar to Frisbee with it. Everyone took a seat around the kitchen table. I hereby call this special session of the Lanchop family meeting to order, announced Mr. Lanchop. Let's begin by welcoming our esteemed guest, said Mrs. Lanchop. Mr. Dart, would you like a snack? She slid a bowl across the table. It was filled with chips sprinkled with the secret ingredient that Stanley had recently retrieved from Mexico. Stanley stared at his hand. He was thinking that he should go to Africa to see the flat skull. Maybe he wasn't so alone after all. I want to get mail to Africa, he declared. Absolutely not, said Mrs. Lanchop. It's one thing to fly airmail to the major cities like Tokyo and Cairo and Mexico City. Who knows how often mail is delivered in the most remote regions of Africa? Your mother is right, Stanley said, Mr. Lanchop. It isn't safe, but I have to. What if the skull is the same as me? Mr. and Miss Lanchop exchanged looks. No way, Arthur blurted as if reading their mind. I'm not missing another big adventure. Stanley gets to circle the globe while I have to stay home and miss all the fun. It isn't fair. These are the most delicious chips I've ever tasted, said Mr. Dart, shoveling another handful in his mouth. Maybe we should all go, Mr. Lanchop suggested. I can, George, said Miss Lanchop. I'm hosting my fundraiser for the Grammar Society on Saturday. I still have to dot the I's and cross the T's and all of the place cards. Besides, how could we possibly afford airplane tickets to Africa? Perhaps you could fly courtesy of the famous museum, said Mr. Dart. After all, investigating a major archaeological find would clarify as official museum business. It's the least we could do for you, Stanley, after all your help. Of course, we could justify only 2 airplane tickets to our board of directors, added Mr. Dart. Arthur groaned. That figures. I could stay folded in the pocket on the back of the airplane seat, Stanley offered, so both you and Dad could come. You would do that? Said Arthur. Sure, said Stanley. I'd only slip from under the seat belt anyway. That settles it, decided Mr. Lanchop. Boys, pack your bags for Africa. All right, I'm kind of liking this one. I haven't read this one, actually. So far, I've only read one of the ones I think we read. The other ones I haven't read, but I hope you guys enjoyed it. This will be the new series, or this will be the new one we're reading, and please, please, please read along with me. I really enjoy reading it, and I hope you enjoy listening to it. All right, talk to you soon, guys. Bye.